It's Wednesday, February 1st, 2017, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, a call from Steve Bannon for the news media to listen more and keep its mouth shut. We'll talk about how some have responded to it, and I'll ask Mike and Ernest for their responses, too. George Orwell published 1984 in 1949. Whoever would have thought it would become a bestseller in 2017? We'll talk about exactly what it is about today's political climate that has people picking up dystopian fiction like never before. And our own little tribute to a star of the stage and screen who had her own powerful impact on the world of journalism. But we have got to start off today by talking about the executive order issued Friday night limiting travel into the United States by people from Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and Libya for 90 days, and the banning of refugees from those countries coming in for 120, and refugees from Syria indefinitely. The stories of people being detained, deported, most of them coming in with valid visas and green cards. Let's go beyond the executive order itself and talk about some of the media angles that have been associated with this. The conservative press really fueled a lot of the fear and the anxiety around some of these populations coming from the countries.
Yeah, I think they did, and it's just an extension of the campaign. There are lots of headlines that are either false or headlines that are based on a small fact and blown up into something big. But I think also there's the more general sense that we're seeing a real division right now between how this story is being portrayed by the whatever you want to call them, the mainstream media, the big media, and the conservative media. I mean, it is black and white. I mean, most of the mainstream media are talking about the confusion. They're talking about whether or not it's constitutional, about the firing of the assistant attorney general. And what the conservative media are talking about almost exclusively is Trump is trying to protect America, and here are folks who are trying to keep America from being protected.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I was at the gym last night, and they had the TVs up, and actually Fox News was on, and they brought up former President Obama, and I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute, he's gone." Yeah, why are you bringing him up in this? You know, and it was all about trying to pretty much lay out this argument that this is not about the banning of immigrants or as some would say, a war on Muslims. This is about protecting Americans from potential terrorists coming into the country, and that's where the conservative media have sort of drawn a line. But when you go and you look at the mainstream media, like what Mike says, the other media, I guess you could put it that way, they're talking about, here's how this issue has damaged our relationships abroad. Here's how it has made America look. Here's the constitutional crisis that we have. Here's how families are being impacted by this. Not only families who are here, but families who are abroad and potentially want to come here.
Looking to come back. Just out of curiosity, for some time context, when you were at the gym last night and the mention of Obama, was that before or after the naming of the new Supreme Court nominee?
This was before the naming of the new Supreme Court.
Just curious, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. For a lot of reporters, this is also a personal story, a personal issue. Reporters who are immigrants or the children of immigrants finding themselves in a really uncomfortable position in how they cover this.
They're uncomfortable in how they're covering this because they see the impact that it could have on families personally and on them personally, and they're bringing that into their journalism. Now, some of them are trying to show that in a way that Americans can see this is not about the whole protection argument that the conservative media is bringing to the table. So you're starting to see that human element come into the story, and I think that that's something that maybe the Trump administration didn't quite calculate in how they rolled this out. And there's the other part of the story, is that the way in which they rolled this out actually created a lot of the confusion that's going on. And one of the stories that I haven't seen a lot of is how this has put Americans in danger overseas, not just expats, but you're talking about military personnel, you're talking about diplomatic personnel all over the world have been put in danger because of this, and the perception that it is placed in the minds of the people that they're dealing with on a daily basis.
And there has been a little bit of the reporting about the cables that are being put together
By
in
the State
Department and embassy workers, but still not a whole lot that explains what's going on there, what the magnitude of that is, when or if that's ever happened in the past, and what impact that has had.
I do think whether you're talking about, as you're asking your first question, about journalists who are experiencing it or just other Americans who are experiencing this up close, we need to tell more of those stories. And that's one of the reasons I really liked the way that local media, including the local media here in the Columbia area, have covered that story. Yes, they had the protest stories. Yes, they had the sort of stories of laying the yellow flowers at the Islamic Center and some of the different things that you'd expect people to cover. It was right there in front of them. But there were also a lot of good stories of just about whether it was students or other people in this country and the very real things that are happening to them. So I thought that coverage was very positive. On the other hand, let's just say take the Columbia Daily Tribune, which is one of the media in town that I think did a good job covering that story. Go to the comment sections on any one of those stories, and you will see firsthand up close that partisan ideological divide, the hateful rhetoric. There were references in multiple comments there to fake news on both sides of the story, and so you get both the kind of coverage we need and the kind of reaction that I think makes it very difficult for us to do our jobs.
There was actually some discussion in the newsroom of the Wall Street Journal, some directive that was given to staffers about the language that they were using, and that there's some really upset staffers in there about being told not to describe the affected countries as being majority Muslim.
Yeah, and this story came out, I think the New York Times was one of the first news organizations along with BuzzFeed to actually come out and talk about this, where you had the editor basically come out and say, you need to be careful about the way in which you describe these countries. This goes to something that many at the Wall Street Journal feared when Rupert Murdoch took over the newspaper, was that there was going to be these kinds of directives when it comes to how news is being described. And this is something that Fox News has dealt with over and over and over again about how they're going to frame stories. And the Wall Street Journal, at least the people in the newsroom, were told they wouldn't have to deal with this. But apparently that's not the case.
I could see the conservative critique about stop saying Muslim majority countries when you're framing the story exclusively one way and not talking about security. If it were not for the thing we talked about at the very beginning of the show, all of these right-wing online media organizations making it about Islam, not just about terrorism. And if you have people inside the Trump administration who keep saying that, you had Rudy Giuliani on the air
with Fox News.
We're talking about how, well, the president gave me orders to come up with a way to make this happen when the focus was on Muslims. So, I think journalists have a right to use that kind of shorthand when those are the signals coming out of the White House.
Especially when you have the president himself saying, this is to protect the country from radical Islamic terrorists. Mm-hmm. Okay. But that's not the image that you saw on Saturday and Sunday.
As you hear stories about 5-year-old children being detained and handcuffed.
Exactly. So the images doesn't match the rhetoric. And that's where the Trump administration, I think, really dropped the ball on how they determined they were going to do this.
So maybe part of that, not to jump to any conclusions, but we talked last week, too, about how the Trump administration was setting up kind of an MO, if you will, of making a move to deflect or distract from something else that was going on that maybe we shouldn't be paying attention to. At the same time, this executive order is being handed down on Friday. The unprecedented move of appointing Steve Bannon to the National Security Council and replacing the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah, you have quite a few Republicans who actually most Democrats came out and said this is a bad move. But then you had quite a few Republicans come out and say, wait a minute, you're politicizing a part of the national security apparatus that is not meant to be politicized. Because the only reason that you would put Steve Bannon in the position that he's in now into that is because you want to make sure that the political message is somehow a part of the decision making when you're talking about national security issues.
You know, I've talked a lot on this program about whether or not some in the news media can walk and chew gum at the same time. And it's possible that the White House can deflect journalists from certain stories by throwing the red meat out there. But you mentioned the name Steve Bannon, and everyone in the news media is going to zero in on it because of his fraught relationship with the press. I mean, I think the only thing the White House did in terms of press management this past few days that actually helped them with that narrative was the Supreme Court nomination. That was very well managed in terms of the media.
Well managed, and a choice that those from the left maybe don't have a whole lot of room to complain about, given that he was appointed to the appeals court by a voice vote unanimously.
Oh, they'll complain about it, and there's already multi-million-dollar campaigns from the left and the right to support or oppose his nomination. There are members in the Senate who might go along with the notion that we don't need 60 votes if it wasn't for the fact that Republicans kept President Obama from getting Merrick Garland appointed to the Supreme, getting a hearing for the Supreme.
And that's the narrative that you're starting to hear more and more, not so much against
him
against points, yes, but against the fact that this was a stolen seat, because President Obama made the nomination and he didn't even get a hearing, and the reason for it was because, as Mitch McConnell said at the time, we want the next president, be it Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, to be the one making this decision and not Obama.
And, you know, I read something this morning that said that would be the perfect first question to put to him in a confirmation hearing is, should that other appointee have gotten that hearing that he did not get? And how do you respond to that as a constitutional scholar, expert?
Right.
I mean, I think there's a fair amount of good media speculation about whether or not this wasn't sort of the opening gambit for the Trump administration in terms of Supreme Court nominees, because Neil Gorsuch, as he is very conservative, but he's also well respected. He clerked for Anthony Kennedy. I mean, he did, as you say, receive unanimous vote for his appeals court position out in Denver. But perhaps the Trump administration, as many in the news media are suggesting, is putting him forward first because that might get Judge Kennedy to step down, and then he can replace him with somebody in the mold of a real populist, firebrand conservative, the kind of person that Trump might be not able to get through the first time, but maybe the second time.
Well, I mean, and that's going to be interesting, because the question becomes, is this okay? He's putting him up now. There may be another possibility for another seat later. Will that come before or after the midterms? Because
I have a bad feeling that somebody's health will depend on that. Well, we have no way of knowing how that's going to play out.
We have no way of knowing how that's going to play out. But if Mike is right and Kennedy decides to step out, does he make that decision before or after the midterms? That's going to have a bearing on what Trump is going to be able to do.
And for that matter, I mean, if the Senate Democrats decide to really make this a brutal battle, insist on 60 votes and all of that, that will give the Senate what the ammunition they need with a second nomination to say no, simple majority is going to work for them.
The interesting thing about where we are now in terms of the Democrats, particularly in the Senate, is are they going to be a check on the president and a check on the rest of the Senate in the way that the Republicans were when Obama was in? Because the base is expecting them to do that, and all indications are that they're trying to figure out which way they want to go, and the base is pretty much screaming right now. And I think the media is doing a very good job of covering this divide between what the Senate Democrats want to do and what their base is basically demanding that they do.
Okay, well, Thursday, the day before that executive order was signed, Steve Bannon talked to the New York Times, and during that interview, he said a number of controversial things, among them that the news media should be humiliated and embarrassed and keep its mouth shut and just listen for a while. You can imagine how that went over. ProPublica printed up T-shirts that you can buy if you want to that say, "We're not shutting up." And CNN's Jake Tapper said this.
A reminder that the president's top aide just told the New York Times that the press should keep its mouth shut. No.
I know that you're going to have a lot that you're going to want to say about this, but I want to pour a little bit more gasoline on the fire first. You see, because Kellyanne Conway went on Fox News Sunday this week, and Chris Wallace asked her about those alternative facts and reporters rebelling against that comment. Here's how that conversation went down.
Biased media coverage is easy to detect. It frankly helped us because this was such an elite rejection election where the establishment, the elites were all rejected by the voters. It turns out there are a heck of a lot more of them than us, Chris, and that's how we won. Why is that relevant? It's relevant because people, who's cleaning house? Which one is going to be the first network to get rid of these people who said things that just weren't true? Talk about fake news, talk about alternative facts. What happened last week? I went on 3 network Sunday shows. I spoke for 35 minutes on 3 network Sunday shows. You know what got picked? The fact that I said alternative facts, not the fact that I ripped a new one to some of those hosts for never covering the facts that matter to America's women.
Okay, so I don't even know what to ask because I've been watching these 2 clips kind of for days and my head just keeps shaking. She wants to know which network is going to line up first to clean house.
You know, first of all, whether you take what she said or what Bannon said, and I think we can reject them in the way that they were, in the context that they were made. I don't think journalists are going to shut up and journalists shouldn't be shutting up. I don't think that news organizations are going to let go their pundits just because they disagreed with the president. On the other hand, I think sometimes we can take some truths from these unintended phrases. So, for example, Steve Bannon says journalists need to listen. He's right.
All right.
We shouldn't be shutting up and just doing whatever the White House wants, but we should listen. We still haven't learned the lesson. We haven't proven that we've learned the lesson.
In fact,
that there are a lot of voters out there we don't know.
I sat in on a great lesson this morning from one of our professors, Liz Brixey, on the value of listening and the importance of it. So,
and I also say that in terms of what Kellyanne Conway said, no White House should be pressuring news organizations to fire people because they don't agree with your politics. On the other hand, I think it would be fabulous if the cable news networks would get rid of hours and hours of pundits talking about the news and spend some of those hours with reporters reporting the news.
When we've been talking about that for years now is the fact that, number one, you're right, Mike, we don't listen. Number two, we aren't telling people stories. We're sitting around a table and we're talking about what we think as opposed to what real Americans are thinking across the spectrum. So I think if they got back to that, then they would be okay. However, I do think that what the White House is doing is, and you talked about this a minute ago, is they're deflecting the media away from what the real stories are. So when she goes out there, when Bannon goes out there, they're still on that playbook that they used in the campaign, and it is working because and when I say we, I'm talking about the media, we're spending way too much time talking about what they're saying and not what they're doing.
And it's the easy, almost you might say pleasurable thing to do is to give as good as you get, right? Yeah. But we need to rise above that as journalists and do our job. Yeah.
So every year we talk about the White House Correspondents' Dinner and the potentially messy ethical situations it can create for reporters who get a little buddy-buddy with the government figures that they cover. Well, this year brings a new layer of a lot of things to the mix. It's enough of a new layer that comedian Samantha Bee says she's going to hold another roast of the president at the same time as the White House Correspondents Association's event. How much of this do you think is resistance, and how much of it is entertainment determined to, or meant to create alternative programming for TBS?
I think that she's sort of playing off of what her old boss Jon Stewart used to do, and I think from a sort of Daily Show kind of way, it's a brilliant idea. Okay. The question becomes, is the White House Correspondents Association going to actually have this dinner? Because the relationship between the Trump administration and the press right now is so toxic that I'm not sure who would actually show up.
So the White House Correspondents' Dinner
I hope someone does. It's meant to raise money for scholarships for our students.
It's in late April. Okay, that's like that's like 10 years in Trump media time, I think. So who knows what's going to happen? I think it will probably occur. I think there will be some attempt for even a day to have some rapprochement between the Trump press people and the White House. On the other hand, I have said for a long time, I think the White House Correspondents' Dinner, except for the scholarships given to students, is a big fat waste of time. It's all about celebrity crushes that the media people have. It wouldn't bother me, except for the money, if it went away. Samantha,
But I think there are other ways you could get that money other than having a big dinner.
I just hope that Samantha Bee, if she does her thing, and I think it'll be funny, she'll get a lot of comedians, because a lot of comedians and a lot of entertainers don't like President Trump. But is it just going to be, as one of the headlines on our blog had it, the roast that angry liberals crave, or will it be something that's a little broader and maybe pokes fun at others like the media or Democrats as well as the president?
Yeah.
Well, most of us read 1984 and Animal Farm as teenagers. It was forced reading in middle and high school literature classes. Our teachers introduced us to the concepts of the tale of the Russian Revolution and what became called the Orwellian nightmare. At the time, most of us plowed through those books, wondering why we had to read them and wondering when we'd be through. Now, as adults, people are clamoring to read them. Amazon selling out of stock and sending the book back into print.
Well, I think it's one of the ways that people are trying to figure out what's going on. And they've gone to fiction because in these books, there are some similarities to things that are going on. Not necessarily the exact thing that's going on, but it's a way of connecting. I mean, you see it all the time where people are saying, this Orwellian kind of decision that was made. So, I mean, I think that's what's happening.
So what do you think the underlying motivation is? Is it nostalgia or is it fear?
I don't know for sure. Probably a little bit of both, and probably a little bit of the media telling this story, and people go, oh yeah, I'm going to go on Amazon and buy this book. I mean, this is part of the story that I find kind of interesting to me. It's great if folks want to, and they should read 1984 and Animal Farm, and It Can't Happen Here, and all these. They should read those books. I think it's useful. But I also think this is a classic example of the herd mentality of the media. Like The Guardian and PBS and NPR do this story last Wednesday. The next day, the New York Times does a version of the story. The next day, CNN does a version of the story.
And then people start reading the book again.
And I'll admit I went looking to see if it was still on my bookshelf or if it was in storage somewhere. There have been a lot of staffing changes at 60 Minutes over the years, especially with the deaths of some of the original reporters on that program, Morley Safer in the last year, and some of the newcomers as well, Bob Simon in a car crash 2 years ago. That has left a void on the show and a need for 60 Minutes to re-find its voice and to rebuild its audience. Maybe its newly named contributor, Oprah Winfrey, will help with that. What kind of work is it expected that she's going to be doing?
That's going to be the interesting part. I'm going to assume that she's going to be able to do the kind of interviews that 60 Minutes has been known for, and we haven't seen a lot of those. And she does a lot of that on her own network, almost on a daily or weekly basis.
Her own network called
Right. So I think that's what they would like to bring her in, but I think they're also trying to gather a new kind of audience to watch 60 Minutes. Yes, she's going to come in with some interesting issues, like the fact that she's on the board of Weight Watchers and she owns part of that. The problem, the issues she's had in terms of her influence on book publishing and that sort of thing. So there's some ethical baggage there that comes into play, but I think they're trying to bring that audience in.
And the book publishing part, I mean, she kind of revolutionized and gave a rebirth to reading in the late 90s and in the 2000s with the Oprah's Book Club. And given how 60 Minutes has been criticized in the past for not always being completely transparent about Simon & Schuster authors and books that they're promoting on that program.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a concern about that. I have maybe a little bit more concern about her relationship with Weight Watchers. I mean,
it's a big one.
She owns part of that company, and that concerns me a little. But frankly, when you say, what is Oprah going to do? She's going to do whatever Oprah wants to do. Yeah. She is a ratings juggernaut for 60 Minutes.
And in that way, she's kind of the Jimmy Buffett of journalism, that she can find a way to take a brand, create it, and build demand around it, regardless of what it is.
And she have her ability to bring people to that show that we just don't have. Who knows what that's going to do?
Okay. Right before we left last week, we were kind of running through a lot of things, had a lot of things to talk about, and then kind of looked at the clock. And Mike, you said to me at that point, if only we would have known. We had one more breaking story we could have gotten in there. And my first thought was, oh, you mean the story from the AP and in the Tribune about Carl Edwards potentially running for Senate? No, that was when you had told me about the death of Mary Tyler Moore. And I want to talk about her. I want to talk about the fictional journalist who inspired generations of women, just like me, to enter this profession. You know who I mean. You've all seen this.
You know what? You got spunk.
Well,
I hate spunk.
I don't know, I still laugh every time I see that. Mary Richards, played by Mary Tyler Moore. She wasn't a real journalist, but she left women of a certain age in a certain generation between 1970 and 1977 wanting to get into this profession, to make it in the big city, to have the apartment with wall-to-wall carpeting.
You know, I mean, I watched it for totally different reasons. I don't know that Mary Tyler Moore. I love Mary Tyler Moore, and I loved her from Dick Van Dyke's show too.
Oh, you don't want my Rob impression.
Or maybe I do. I don't know. But she revolutionized how women could be portrayed on TV,
Yes,
not
she
just
did.
journalists. I mean, you remember when she was Laura Petrie, she and Rob had to have single beds even though they were married. That's what TV was like back then. She gets to be a single woman who, well, at first they said she was going to be divorced. TV wouldn't let that happen, but she'd broken up with her boyfriend, so she didn't have to depend on a man. Her life was, stood on its own. She was learning about a new way of expressing herself. She did a great job amongst a cast of really crazy characters at WJM-TV. I mean, there was so much of that where she was breaking ground, even though people didn't know it or didn't argue about it, because she did it with such great comedic talent.
I mean, the comedic talent, the writing, and the way in which she presented it was transformative in many ways, because, as Mike said, a single woman on a show, a woman being able to carry a situation comedy, that was transformative in and of itself right there, especially in the 70s. So the fact that she did it, and it was about someone who was doing journalism in a small, medium-sized market at the time. I mean, they could have taken that show to New York or somewhere else, and they chose Minneapolis. That in and of itself was sort of revolutionary.
Mike, I do want to back up to one other thing you were talking about with the Dick Van Dyke show and how revolutionary it was that they were sleeping in separate beds. Mary Tyler Moore fought the network to be able to wear pants on that show, which is another fascinating groundbreaking moment.
It also was during the golden age of television, where many more millions of people would be watching that show than are going to be watching anything like it today. And so it was a moment in time that's going to be hard to replicate, but it was a really important moment.
Fun little anecdote, and maybe more fun for me than for the two of you, but I did have a couple of my students who came up to me yesterday or messaged me yesterday and said they were going back and watching the Mary Tyler Moore show, that they had never really watched it before, and either on the MeTV marathons that were running this weekend or buying it on Amazon, going back and beginning to see now why it had the impact that it did. Well, that music means that we are pretty much out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics that we talked about today on our links blog. You can find that under the programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. You can leave us comments or questions. You can see previews of what we'll be talking about next week and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. Travis Meyer is our associate producer. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.